Hello, welcome. Thank you all for coming out this evening. I'm Susanna Hancock. I'm one of the members of the Freeport Sustainability Advisory Board, and we've been working on this community action plan for about a year and a half with a bit more into that, but active planning. So thank you all for coming and being interested. Being part myself of international climate negotiations and taking on the fossil fuel companies, I very often hear, especially in local discussions, that people don't really feel that their local actions matter. You know, that the Paris Agreement will save us, that the UN has it covered, that we need congressional action. And we do need all of these. We do need global and local or national action, but we also need us. 3 days ago, Dr. Jane Goodall and I were together, and she said, despite all necessary international action, what really gives her hope for the future is community work. It's people coming together and saying, this is my town, and I'm going to do something about it. It's the people who step up to take responsibility for doing whatever is in their power to improve their lives. Communities know themselves. They see the impacts. They're affected by changes in fishing, by changes in landscapes and deforestation. But they also can enjoy the results of their own actions. The actions of communities each working together has changed landscapes of deforestation throughout Africa and the Amazon that Jane has seen not only from airplanes, her own travel, but also that's visible from the space station. So it's really exciting for me to engage our community and to know that we're not in isolation doing this. Towns all over Maine and beyond are undergoing very similar processes. So let's come together and be Jane's hope for the future. So with that, I'd like to introduce Maddie Smith here, who's the town sustainability coordinator and has been with us since April. So thank you, Maddie.
Thank you so much, Susanna, and we're really honored to have someone with so much experience on the advisory board, so thanks for that amazing quote from Jane Goodall, and really excited to see you all here and get started. Oops, sorry. That happens every time. I'm quite short. So tonight, we'll have just a brief presentation to lay the foundation, and then some question and answer period after that as you all have questions. And then we'll break out into table activities. And there's 5 table stations across the room, and you're kind of seated at a table based on a topic you may be interested in. After the presentation concludes, if you want to jump up and switch, that's fine. But we'll have 20 minutes in each breakout session. And I heard that a couple folks might be leaving early, and so if you are, no worries, there'll be, first of all, another session on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock right here. And there'll also be opportunities to provide feedback on all this material on our website. So after 3 sessions of 20 minutes or so, we'll reconvene to report back on summaries of what each table group discussed and leave some time for additional Q&A and get everybody out of here before 8 o'clock or so. So I am super happy to be working with the advisory board on the development of a climate action plan for the town of Freeport. So this effort is really led by the board, myself, other town staff, and supported by the Greater Portland Council of Governments, who is here tonight. And we're developing strategies to reduce emissions from the community and prepare for climate change and the impacts of climate change. We really feel that this effort is supporting existing community goals and priorities, and we're also looking forward for this effort to align with existing and future planning efforts. So we want the outcomes and process of this plan to be well aligned and woven into things like the upcoming comprehensive plan, the hazard mitigation plan update, and be based on the spoken priorities that were expressed in the downtown vision process through Connect Freeport and other efforts. And I'm interested to see if there are other community priorities that you know about or other efforts that we can work into this process and align with as well. Certainly don't want this climate action plan to sit on a shelf. We want it to be very actionable and really kind of ready for implementation. And I think the more collaboration and alignment, the better. And I think that Susanna kind of prefaced this, but it's really going to take all of us through this process and also an implementation to make a difference and to meet some of our goals. And so that aspect of local action, if we bring it down to the scale of Freeport, it's really about residents, businesses, municipal staff, organizations, and town committees and boards that are going to be the driving change in our community. So a little bit about the climate action planning process itself. I have been with the town for about 7 months, and the process itself kind of precedes that a little bit. But so far, we've made great progress in the timeline. So we've conducted some analyses process with GPCOG, the Council of Governments, that include a vulnerability assessment and a greenhouse gas inventory. And so both of those reports are kind of the basis and the foundation and the technical analyses that are the backbone of this process. And we'll use those, some of the data from those tonight to help shape strategies, goals, and actions that will be the content of the plan. We also held a first community workshop in May that we were kind of focusing on vulnerability and identifying areas and systems in town where the community felt were more vulnerable to climate impacts like rising seas and flooding. And so using that information, stakeholder input from tonight and tomorrow's session, or Saturday's session, we'll begin to refine and craft a plan that will go to Town Council for review and adoption in the next couple of months. And after that, we'll implement the plan and hopefully have great success in meeting our goals. So I'm going to hand it over to Kelly from Greater Portland Council of Governments to talk a little bit about some high-level results from the greenhouse gas inventory and vulnerability assessment.
Thanks, Maddie. As she said, I'm Kelly Rayberg. I'm the Sustainability Program Manager with GPCOG and have been working throughout the process with the Town of Freeport and FSAB to kind of complete and the climate action plan, and that starts with a lot of the baseline inventory. So we conducted a greenhouse gas inventory that looks at the full range of community and municipal greenhouse gases. So where are your greenhouse gases coming from? And based on our modeling and analysis, the majority is coming from transportation, and that is very similar to what we're seeing at the state and across other communities as well. And most of those transportations come from passenger vehicles. Following the overall transportation, we have stationary energy. So all of your buildings heated by oil, natural gas. We look at the range of fuels being used, and then only a small percentage of your greenhouse gases come from waste. And this is a very broad inventory. It is not meant to be reflective of individual consumers. It is still a modeling software, so we try and say it's kind of high level and a goal to reach and to reduce over time, but understanding there's going to be some variability and some kind of errors within modeling as well. And so approximately 40% of your emissions are from the commercial sector compared to residential and then municipal. So part of that is we looked at overall, as part of the community, we also separated out then municipal emissions. So how much is just kind of the municipality, Town of Freeport within town buildings, town vehicle fleet, how much are they emitting? Overall, it only accounts for about 1% of the full community-wide emissions. But similar to the community, fleet and vehicles are taking up the majority of your emissions. Interestingly, or I guess obviously, for the municipal fleet, diesel is the primary fuel that is using the emissions, followed by natural gas use. And also, we looked at schools and have a call out for that as well, and they account for approximately 1% of the full community-wide emissions as well. The other baseline inventory that we looked at was the vulnerability assessment. So One step is you want to work to reduce your greenhouse gases, but you also want to create a more resilient population. How are your people, your community responding to climate change? How is your landscape, ecosystems going to build resilience to storm surge, flooding, increased precipitation? And so we look at a range of factors to understand where in town might there be vulnerabilities, how can you work to adapt, and prioritize those for the future. So looking at this full range, a few of the high-level things that we found is maintaining access to a lot of your streets, your networks, your critical services. So by 2050, as we experience higher sea levels, greater precipitation, more flooding events, it's going to impact your infrastructure. It might cut off roadways, which would then cut off access to critical services. And so being able to ensure that you have access both for community members to get around, also emergency services, is going to be vital for you in the future. We're also seeing a little more threats to public health. We're already seeing more vector-borne diseases that will continue to rise. We're seeing more ticks, and so therefore more Lyme disease. Also then some extreme heat. And so we have, looking at some heat islands, your downtown has a little bit more impervious surface, so it's considered a heat island. So those who around are going to potentially experience slightly higher heat impacts compared to those who are surrounded all by forests. And then ecosystem, ensuring that you have proper conservation of priority areas. Freeport has a decent amount of tidal marshes, and so making sure that there are conservation areas, open space, ways for those tidal marshes to migrate as sea level rises will become important, and to be able to enhance the resilience of those natural systems and provide a buffer to the built environment around it. And this will all ensure kind of an equitable access as climate change impacts your range of population to make sure that all areas of your community are accounted for and taken into impact. Overall, Freeport is relatively resilient in terms of your social vulnerability, but you do have a higher older population that can be susceptible to high temperatures, more of those diseases, and so ensuring that they have those access and resources are going to be critical. You also do have a higher percentage of households that use heating oil, so not only does that increase your greenhouse gas emissions, but it also causes problems with increased cost and energy use and burdening households who might already not be able to afford some of the materials. So that's kind of a high-level quick look at what's driving some of these actions and strategies and saying, how can we adapt? How can we take this information and improve our community? So with that, we're using those kind of two baselines, as I said, to shape the rest of the plan, and I will turn it back to Mehdi to discuss kind of where you've taken it and some of the emission targets that you are setting.
Thanks, Kelly. So this is more recent news, but really important into the climate action planning process, is that the town council has adopted emission reduction targets based on the recommendations of the Freeport Sustainability Advisory Board. And so in October, we presented a couple of times to the town council, really outlining the value of setting emission reduction targets, which is that it will guide the town's efforts to minimize its contribution to climate change. And they're aspirational goals, but they're also benchmarks to measure progress. So they're kind of serving many values and benefits for the town. And so the reduction targets that were recommended and adopted are a 65% reduction of community emissions by 2030, 85% reduction of community emissions by 2040, and a net zero community by 2050, in addition to striving to have net zero town operations by 2040. And so FSAB used kind of best practices, data, and targets from the international community, as well as other regional examples and considerations for the resource capacity that our town government has and what they'll be able to accomplish. while kind of balancing the urgency of the climate crisis and knowing that we do have to make, pretty aggressive moves to make a big difference in global climate change. And so, as presented to Town Council and as we're kind of going to dive into tonight, meeting those targets has several high-level strategy areas that are being implemented across the country and throughout the world, which is to electrify transportation while getting people out of their cars and using other ways to get around, electrifying buildings and keeping our buildings, or making our buildings much more efficient in energy, and reducing energy demand. So we can't electrify everything and not improve efficiency and reduce demand because we'll be using a whole lot more energy. In addition to diverting waste and thinking about how we can consume items differently to reduce emissions across the life cycle of all the goods we consume. So these are kind of the big categories that we'll be talking about today that we're breaking out into more Freeport-specific actions. And so the plan itself will be laid out into 5 or so kind of topic areas, which are these 5 tables. And those are mobility and land use, buildings and energy, natural resources, community resilience, and waste reduction. And I think it's kind of important to note that we're segmenting these topics for the purposes of the workshop and the plan document, but they're so interconnected, and different actions as we implement them will have benefits that intersect each other. And so striving to get people out of their cars and walking and biking is great to reduce transportation emissions, but it's also promoting healthy lifestyles and reducing air pollution at the same time. And so with that, we'll just pause for any questions on the content of the presentation, and then we could get into activities. And we have some floating microphones if you want to speak into the microphone so the recording can capture your question. Does anybody have questions? A couple up here.
Hi, just a quick question on the 5 plan elements, or no, back to what it looks like, meeting the targets. Where in those 5 things is conversion from fossils to renewable energy?
Yes, that is a good point. I think that that would kind of go with electrifying, is that key piece of electrifying is also greening the grid. And so that kind of necessitates more local renewable energy production and making sure that the grid is relying on clean renewable energy as well. So good point that that's not explicitly called out in here. If I talk about this every day, sometimes I miss it. But yeah, switching to renewable energy is underpinning all of this work. Yeah, thank you.
For the targets that you talked about, are those I see the word aspirational there. What actually is adopted, and is there anything binding there? What do these targets do?
So the targets themselves are not binding. So they're kind of an aspirational target that signals commitment of the town leadership and staff to take action. We will use those targets to make our climate action plan and our modeling more specific and data-driven, but as it was adopted, there's nothing kind of attached that makes the targets themselves binding. Any other questions?
You mentioned the schools earlier. Did they not want to sign on to net zero by 2040 like the town operations?
So as far as I know, the RSU is kind of, since it's split up between a couple of communities, is not necessarily under any kind of control by the town of Freeport. And so this being scoped as a municipal plan, we're kind of focusing on things that the town of Freeport can do, but other schools across the country and potentially in Maine are making those commitments and being combined with municipal targets. So it would be an interesting conversation. I don't know if Susanna, you want to talk a little bit more to that.
Yeah, I can just add to that. That the reason we don't have jurisdiction over the schools is that it is 3 different communities that comprise the RSU. That said, we have done I was until last week on the school board, as was Volley until 53 weeks ago. But we were both on the sustainability committee, and there we implemented solar panels. So it's what 80% of the energy from that the school uses is solar currently, and we have various things. They have just established a curriculum committee to look at developing climate throughout the curricula from kindergarten, pre-K up through 12th grade, and also looking at transportation options. So we are in discussions with them, but we don't have any direct authority over them. But we do connect with Durham and Pownell, their town boards as well, to sort of collectively come together, if that helps you a little bit more.
Awesome. Thank you, Susanna. Any other questions? Yes, you one over here, and then we can go over there.
Yeah, I had kind of more of a point and then also a question. I'll actually ask my question first, which is on the emissions targets, when you're looking at net zero, are you accounting for the sequestration and the storage in our natural systems? Is that how you get to the net number, or are we not accounting for those?
At this point, the definition of net zero that we're operating under is focusing on reduction strategies. So where kind of in the built environment can we reduce emissions, and we're not calculating currently stored or potentially stored carbon in our oceans, forests, things like that. I think that if the community was really interested in a separate analysis to understand where our opportunities to sequester carbon and get to a more granular level, that would be interesting, and we can talk about that. But I think the definition of net zero we're operating under is kind of the emissions that we're producing through our activities.
Okay, that's helpful. The other, just the point that I had, and this kind of gets to the gentleman's point here about decarbonization, that we can't be decarbonizing at the, we can't meet these goals without decarbonizing. That's actually critical, so we need to be explicit about that. But we also can't decarbonize on the backs of our natural systems, and I think you implied this, on the backs of our less advantaged communities, because that's how we have carbonized, right? That's how our systems have been. So unless we really think about this as a whole system, and I think you get at that by saying it's all interrelated, I would just say we won't have been successful, in my view.
Yeah,
Thanks.
excellent point. Thank you.
So I had a question about the inventory, specifically about the commercial versus the residential. Do we have a breakdown of that 40% that's commercial? Is that similar as far as the breakdown of transportation versus building energy use, or what's the internal breakdown there?
The internal breakdown, I might have to get back to you because I have a printout. Right now we have a draft report, and I don't want to speak to numbers off the top of my head, but it's similar breakdown where transportation and buildings among residential and commercial activity are the two main sectors, right? And so I can pull the copy and get back to you if you want. That works.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it strategically makes a difference if if the commercial, since the commercial aspect seems pretty big, if there needs to be different targeting.
I can check the numbers right now and get back to you, but yeah, that is definitely not across waste because we don't have commercial waste data, but we do have building reporting on building energy usage from commercial, and the amount, at least, of vehicle miles traveled by commercial vehicles.
Thank
yeah,
you.
but a great point that, as we finalize the data we have across subsectors and breakdowns, we'll really be able to understand, fuel sources and those subsectors between residential and commercial, so that we can tailor the strategies and kind of the urgency and scale of strategies to be most high impact, so we're not kind of going in the wrong direction as far as mitigating emissions. So if there are no other questions for now, I'd love to break out into groups, so I'll describe some of the activities. Excuse me as I fast forward a couple. So tonight, there are these large action sheets on each table, and they're broken down into goal, strategies, and action ideas. So at this point in the process, we are trying to keep the action ideas high level, so we can dig into some of those details tonight with you all, the how are we going to get these done. And we're looking for your comments on priority. Do you think that these are, which of these do you think are high priority, maybe medium priority, and just looking for conversations at each table about how we can refine these and make them right for Freeport. If you have any major concerns or other ideas, we'd love to hear them. Anything missing. So leaving it pretty loose for each table to have conversation. And again, I'll make a 20-minute announcement and we can switch tables. Sounds good? All right. So I'll leave it there and we can kind of collect in our groups. Thank you so much.
And many
Transportation and trails and saying that's a great way to reduce downshore emissions is probably get people to know that these resources are available.
People to really accept that, right? You've got to focus on the last one because
People are kind of starting to filter out for the evening, and I wanted to make sure we had a chance to do a really brief report out of some of the table activities and just summarize some of the really great conversation and dialogue that we've had. So I'll have microphones be going to the advisory board members, and if those folks could just say a couple words, we'd love to hear some highlights about what you discussed at your table and what's important for the topic. Well, let's start with community resilience. Thanks, Megan.
All right. I think that's on. Yes. Okay. So community resilience had a lot of good conversation. Our white piece of paper is now covered in blue notes with lots of other ideas that came in. So that was fantastic. I think a couple of the themes that came up through the conversations was very much about the interconnectedness of all of these issues, and a lot around the need to really engage and educate the community and people about the impacts of climate change and for them in their lives, and like to incentivize action. And the incentives, I think we talked a lot about how to use policy and financial incentives and other incentives to create a little more teeth in some of the actions that have been recommended around building codes and that sort of thing. I'm reading dots sideways as I'm going here. Lot of interest around supporting local food production and consumption. Thinking around ways that we can, as a town, adopt some best practices for building and different types of policy actions that the town council and committees can be really using as they're making decisions. So to guide decisions around climate best practices as well as around equity and human vulnerabilities. I think another theme that came up was a lot around power, resiliency of power, and where's that power produced, and how do people continue to have access. So more smaller grids, some examples of some incentives that have been offered in other places for battery storage, and more to provide people with access to heat pumps and solar. So lots of good ideas, a lot more than we can call out here.
Thank you so much. And I'm jotting them down on the screen just so we can see them all together. But let's go to, who wants to go next? Say a couple words.
So this table was originally called Natural Resources, but we decided that we need a better title. So Mary, take note. People are more inclined to have this table be called for the next workshop, Healthy Lands and Waters, or Ecosystem Health and Resiliency, or something that speaks to the fact that we're trying to protect green spaces and blue waters. So what they were saying, for the most part, had to do with regional approach to protecting bodies of water. Say McCoy Bay shares 2 coastlines, one in Freeport, one in Brunswick. Same if you go south towards Yarmouth. So emphasizing regional work, because whatever we do on one coast doesn't actually cause the effect that we want if people on the other side of the bay are doing something completely different. So working regionally, we know our neighbors and we should be working together. There was a lot of conversation about not only just how to preserve marshes through buying the marshes themselves and protecting the marshes by ownership, but also how we can manage the areas around the marshes to minimize the impact of sea level rise and climate change. So if we, to the extent that we could incentivize people not to put up rock walls, clear cut the coastline, basically have lawn all the way to the water, fertilize, use pesticides. So ordinances that we can implement to make sure that the runoff that there is minimized and it doesn't have any toxic substances that end up in our waters of bodies of water, sorry. Then there was also conversation about best management practices for road maintenance and road management in terms of salting, sanding, ditches. Why do we have ditches that basically take the water from the road with all the oils and everything that accumulates on the pavement straight into our water? So that was basically the highlight of what was spoken and talked about here. We have a lot of details that will actually be sent your way, but that was the bigger picture.
Thank you so much, and I love the new title, so we'll workshop that. Awesome. Next group.
She beat you to it.
All right, this was the waste reduction table, and one of the main themes here was how we could use, the town's power of the town to control what materials come into the town. So reducing and substituting. So noting that Freeport was an early adopter of the styrofoam ban, which forced McDonald's to make a different clamshell. Like, what else can we do to, get our vegetables from not coming in these little plastic tubs, limit the amount of bottled water that comes in here, because that's a double whammy, because then we get rid of the single-use plastic, and we also have a transportation emissions drop, because that's very heavy, and, there's the big trucks and all those emissions. So looking at that kind of thing. So definitely reduction and substitution, and using ordinances and bans, like we have the plastic bag ban. Do we have a straw ban? I'm not even sure. And then another thing that was popping up was the issue of composting and more education and thinking of ways to link the waste food, potentially even the food that restaurants have, because we do have a lot of restaurants. At the end of the day, I was listening to this show on NPR, and there was a woman who had developed this app. We don't have it here locally, but it would link people with the food that was left over at the restaurant, the meals that were made, at a discounted price. And so you could go on this app, you're going to go get dinner, and you could just go, oh, okay, I'm going to go to whatever the restaurant is. So thinking of models that we could do here. Maybe that app isn't here, but that. And then there was another one around also using the power of the town ordinances and zoning is the minimizing construction and demolition waste by having reduction recycling plans for all the building permits, designated by square footage, things like that. And that's pretty much it. A lot of education and not putting it all on the backs of the residents, using the town's power in terms of these bans and these policies and ordinances, so it doesn't come down to the residents to have to figure out, like, is this plastic recyclable? Can I send it to EcoMaine? Do I bring it to Shaw's? Does it have to go in my trash bin? It is so confusing, and that shouldn't be the problem for all the residents to have to untangle that every time. So that's waste.
Thanks, Mandy. And now we are headed to, looks like buildings. Okay, sorry, Jim.
This is the buildings and energy table, and we had some really good discussions. There's a lot of interest in what fossil fuel use reduction can be done in government facilities, especially a lot of interest in discontinuing the use of fossil fuel heating and cooling in newly constructed municipal facilities, and switching to electric in government buildings to the point of retrofit. And then also, as far as decarbonization in new development and energy efficiency, that was really something that we thought should be emphasized. One interesting idea for kind of a synergy had to do with the new state law that's encouraging or allowing the manufacture of second houses on properties. And in a lot of ways that seemed like a good idea, but especially if in Freeport we could somehow encourage or incentivize very energy efficient construction for these new buildings, and ideally possibly small sizes rather than big mansions. So anyway, that was a potential synergy there. And then there's also kind of on the commercial scale or area as far as electrification, energy efficiency, there is this commercial PACE ordinance that involves having a structure for providing low interest loans for commercial facilities to do energy efficiency retrofits, kind of like the low interest loans you can get for insulating your own house, but at a commercial scale. So there was interest in supporting that. Also, like you mentioned, trying to think of some incentives, and not just all regulatory sticks, but some incentives as well to make this transition. So anyway, those were a few of the highlights, but lots of other ideas and some new items put on Post-its as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jim. Sounds like a great conversation. And I think mobility is last, mobility and land use.
I say tomato. Mobility and land use. Okay, so what came up with this one is, in particular, these are like the big ticket items, no matter how you get around it. So starting with like talking about transportation, obviously the most obvious thing is that public transportation. There's a couple of things going on. Most people agree it needs to be dealt with regionally. That's not something that Freeport standalone really can manipulate.
And then in terms of just internal traffic and congestion with Freeport, couple of things going on. There's the anticipation that we are only going to become even more populated as people relocate due to climate change to Maine. And so it's one of those double-edged swords where you have to get ahead of it in terms of urban planning and designing that village sort of concept so that people can actually access what they need on a daily basis from where they live, walking, biking, that sort of thing. And yet, how do you do that and still keep things affordable for the people that live here now, so they're not getting taxed out of their homes, so that we can create this, really sustainable lifestyle. And then the other piece with a lot of these elements of mobility and land use is changing mindset and changing the way people think about how they live and move and work. So a lot of these things, really, there aren't ordinances and standards and things. I mean, there are standards. You can't kind of ordinance your way out of this. So a lot of people were sort of like, well, like, how do you do this? Where do you start with mobility and land use? Talked about charging stations, obviously having them well-placed and accessible and enough to accommodate as people start transitioning to EVs. And safety. I think the thing people are most concerned about is those people who are, would be willing to start biking or walking or, scootering around. There is no continuous pathway to do that, even just to get your kids to school or to get yourself to the grocery store. So maybe I think that's sort of what people were jumping on first, is that you just have to make pathways more safe, even if they're not, complete streets standards. We have a lot of new Post-its on ours, and I don't have my glasses.
You actually said
Just have one route, I was just thinking from Moore Street to the library, just one super visible, so apparent for children kind of route. Then we don't have to get lost and all.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and I think this report out kind of really helps us see some of the highlights of the conversation. We have a lot more work to do in the process to keep collecting information like this from the upcoming workshop on Saturday. Again, every material here is available on our website, so if you didn't get a chance to go to another table tonight, you're more than welcome to go online and post your comments so we can see them. Next steps for our group include collecting all this information and working with town staff and stakeholders to refine and prioritize the action ideas further. And we thank you very much for coming tonight and participating. Again, great conversation. And tell your friends to come on Saturday. And otherwise, you can we're here until 8, so you can leave more comments on different tables, or you're free to go home. Thank you very much.